I always believed that the heart knew its own truth, that it whispered quietly but firmly when something real was coming your way. But I was wrong. The moment I realized I was in love with him was the exact moment I thought I had lost him forever. It wasn't some grand gesture or romantic scene in the rain that did it. No, it was the kind of quiet heartbreak that shook me to my core, leaving me unable to breathe for a few endless seconds. It happened in the middle of what I thought was an ordinary day. He was just standing there across the room, his back turned to me as he laughed with a friend. I remember how his laugh seemed to echo through the walls of the coffee shop, light and full of life. But something about it was different this time. There was a distance in his smile, an absence in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. And in that moment, a dreadful thought struck me like a hammer. What if I never get to tell him how I feel? The rush of panic was almost overwhelming, and as I stood frozen in place, my mind raced to memories I had buried deep beneath years of denial. It hit me like a tidal wave. How long I had been living in the shadow of my own feelings, pretending they weren't there, convinced that I could walk away from the truth. We'd been friends for years, close like family, sharing everything from late-night talks to weekend hikes. The connection between us was undeniable, but somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that it was just friendship, just two souls aligned in perfect camaraderie. But then came that moment, when his back was turned and I saw him laughing at something someone else said, so effortlessly, so genuinely. It was as though I wasn't there at all. I could lose him, I realized in that instant. Not just as a lover, but as a friend, as someone who was part of the very fabric of my life. I was losing him, and I hadn't even had the courage to tell him how much he meant to me. Everything in that split second made sense, and nothing did at the same time. The weight of years spent with him, living side by side in this unspoken, one-sided love, came crashing down. It wasn't just the fear of rejection that paralyzed me. It was the fear of not ever having had the chance to say what I needed to say. I watched him walk away from the counter, his figure cutting through the crowd, and it felt as if my chest had caved in. The air grew thin, the space between us felt like a chasm, and for the first time I saw him as someone I could lose, not just someone who would always be there. That's when the most unexpected thing happened. My hand reached out, almost without my mind's permission, as if my body was finally rejecting all the years of silence. But before I could call his name, he stopped dead in his tracks, his shoulders tensing as though he had felt the pull too. He turned slowly, his eyes locking with mine in a way that shattered every carefully built wall around my heart. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, he felt it too, the same unspeakable, undeniable truth. The world around us faded as he took a single step toward me. Time, space, everything seemed to shrink to just the two of us. My heart was pounding, but my mouth felt dry, as if every word I had rehearsed in my mind had evaporated the moment he turned around. He stood there, just a few feet away now, his gaze intense but unreadable, like he was searching for something in my face, something I didn't even know how to show. For a moment, the silence stretched painfully, the kind of silence that fills you with both dread and hope at the same time. I wanted to speak, to confess everything I had been hiding for years, but I couldn't. Instead, he did something that caught me completely off guard. He reached out, gently brushed his hand against my arm and whispered, "Are you okay?" I blinked, unsure whether the question was about my sudden stillness or something deeper, something I hadn't yet processed. Was I okay? How could I be okay when all I wanted was to tell you that I love you? The thought was so loud in my head, it almost drowned out his voice when he asked again, this time more insistent. Hey, talk to me. You seem different. His expression shifted to concern, his eyes searching me with a tenderness that both terrified and comforted me. I could feel the weight of every moment that had led up to this. The countless conversations where I had held back, the moments of almost touching, almost confessing, never daring to cross the line between friendship and something more. And now, standing in front of me, was the very thing I had spent years avoiding, the truth. But before I could respond, his phone buzzed, interrupting the fragile moment we had shared. He glanced at it, and just as quickly his expression shifted. The warmth in his eyes faded into something harder, something distant. "I have to take this," he said quickly, stepping away before I could process what was happening. The air seemed to chill as he walked to the far side of the cafe, leaving me standing there, confused and helpless. The bubble that had formed between us popped, and I was left staring at him, wondering what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was that moment of connection just a figment of my desperate longing? Or had he felt it too, but just couldn't say it? I watched him speak briefly into the phone, his back to me again, and in that moment, something sharp and real hit me. The way he had turned away so quickly, so easily. The realization that I might never have the courage to say what I needed to scared me more than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just the fear of rejection anymore. It was the fear of him pulling away, not because of me, but because of something else, something I hadn't yet understood. It wasn't just a question of love. It was a question of timing, of whether the moment we shared was meant to happen, or if it was just another in a long line of what-ifs. And right then, standing alone, I realized something that made my stomach twist. Maybe I wasn't the only one afraid of taking that final step. I stood there, my mind racing, heart pounding as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My thoughts were a blur of confusion and disbelief. He was just here, so close, so real. And then, just like that, he was a world away. The warmth that had enveloped us, that brief moment where everything seemed aligned, was now slipping through my fingers like sand. I wanted to run after him, to stop him before he disappeared completely into whatever had pulled him away, but my legs felt frozen, trapped in the weight of my own hesitation. What was I supposed to do now? Should I have spoken up earlier when the tension between us was thick enough to cut with a knife? Or had this been it? Had I missed my one and only chance? As if on cue, I heard a soft voice behind me, his voice. "Hey." I turned around quickly, almost too quickly, and there he was, standing just a few feet away, his phone now tucked into his pocket. His eyes were softer now, less guarded, but there was still something off, something different. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice low. "I didn't mean to make you feel like I was ignoring you." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, but my mind was still reeling from what had just transpired. I nodded, forcing a smile that felt like a mask more than anything. "It's fine." I stopped myself, unsure of how to explain what was happening inside me, how my world had tilted on its axis in the span of a few seconds. But before I could find the words, he took a step closer, and then another, his presence overwhelming, suffocating even. And then, in a move I never saw coming, he gently cupped my face in his hands, his touch sending a shockwave of warmth through my body. "I don't know what's going on with me," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "But I feel like I've been waiting for you to say something for a long time." My heart stopped. His words hung in the air between us like a fragile thread, and in that moment, everything I had been hiding, all the years of suppressed feelings, all the moments I had kept to myself, came crashing down. He had felt it too. All this time he had felt it. The same pull, the same connection. My chest tightened as I stared into his eyes, searching for any sign that he wasn't just saying this out of some misguided attempt to make me feel better. But then he did something even more unexpected. He leaned in, slowly, deliberately, as though testing the waters, and kissed me. It wasn't a passionate kiss, not at first. It was hesitant, tender, as though we were both afraid of what would happen if we let go completely. But it was everything I had been waiting for, everything I had never dared to ask for. And in that kiss, I realized something that knocked the breath out of me. I had spent so much time wondering if he could love me back, that I hadn't stopped to wonder if I was ready to love him the way I always dreamed. Because in that moment, as his lips softly brushed against mine, I understood that this wasn't just about finally confessing the love I had hidden for so long. It was about the quiet, messy, beautiful journey of figuring out what love even means when it's not just about a feeling, but about timing and courage, and allowing yourself to be vulnerable enough to step into the unknown. The kiss lingered in the air between us, a silent promise, but the world around us didn't stop. The cafe hummed with noise, with people rushing past, lost in their own little worlds, yet here we were, suspended in something so fragile, so new that I feared if I blinked it might shatter. I pulled away slightly, my forehead resting against his, unsure of what came next, unsure of what any of it meant. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and uncertainty, as though he were waiting for me to make sense of it all. The words I had been rehearsing in my mind felt too small now, too insignificant. What do you say after you've spent years avoiding the truth, and now that it's here, it's nothing like you expected? I began, but my voice faltered. How do you put something as chaotic and overwhelming as love into words when it's not neat or simple, when it feels like it's both everything and nothing at once? I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. And it was true. I didn't, because even though everything inside me screamed to say I love you, the fear of getting it wrong, of saying something that might ruin the fragile moment we had created, held me back. And then, unexpectedly, he smiled, his thumb gently brushing the side of my face. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice soft but certain. I think we both know what this is, and that's enough for now." I could feel the weight of his words, how much courage it took for him to be that vulnerable, to let go of all the barriers he'd built around his heart. It struck me then how long he must have been struggling with the same emotions I had. He had never been distant or indifferent, but there had always been something about him, something in the way he held back, like he was waiting for something to shift, waiting for me to make the first move. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. We had both been stuck in this strange, tangled web of unspoken feelings, both too afraid to cross the line into something deeper, more real. But in that moment, the hesitation started to fall away. The fear that had kept me locked in a place of silence for so long began to unravel. And as I looked at him, truly looked at him, I realized that this was no longer about what ifs or maybes. This was happening right here, right now. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong about everything I had ever thought about love. Maybe it wasn't about perfection, about finding the perfect timing, the perfect words. Maybe it was simply about the quiet acceptance that, for once, we didn't have to be anything other than ourselves. Together. I took a deep breath, letting it all sink in, and then, for the first time in a long while, I smiled. It wasn't a perfect smile, and it wasn't without its own fears, but it was real, and it felt like freedom. The kind of freedom that comes when you finally stop running from your own heart and allow yourself to just feel. And in that moment, standing there with him, I realized something I had never understood until now. I had spent so much of my life afraid of falling in love because I thought it meant losing myself. But in truth, it was the exact opposite. The moment I realized I was in love with him was the moment I stopped hiding, stopped pretending. It was the moment I found the courage to embrace who I really was and who we could be together. But as the silence stretched between us, something shifted again, something I hadn't expected, something that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He pulled back slightly, his expression now clouded with uncertainty, his eyes flickering to the side as though he were battling with something inside himself. For a split second, I thought I saw something darker behind his gaze, something that made my stomach tighten with sudden dread. His hand, still on my face, trembled ever so slightly, and for a moment I wondered if I had misread everything. "I've been lying to myself," he said quietly, almost to himself, his voice cracking in a way that made my heart twist. The words hung in the air between us like a sharp, painful truth. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask what he meant, but before I could get a word out, he continued, his eyes never meeting mine. "I've been pretending to be okay with just being your friend, but I'm not. I'm not okay with it anymore. I—" His words faltered again, and I could see him struggling to hold it together, to explain the chaos of emotions that had been swirling in him all this time. The shock hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been so sure that I was the one carrying the burden of unspoken feelings, but now I understood. He had been carrying it too, all along. And somehow it had never occurred to me that the distance between us wasn't just my doing, it had been his too. The weight of this unspoken truth fell heavily between us. I felt as if the ground beneath my feet had disappeared, leaving me adrift in a sea of questions, uncertainties, and raw emotion. And then, as if the universe itself had decided to intervene, I saw something in his eyes that shattered my every assumption. His vulnerability was no longer something to be afraid of. It was something to embrace, something beautiful. He finally looked at me, his eyes brimming with emotion, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've always been afraid of losing you, of losing what we have. But now," he paused, his face softening, "I can't keep pretending I'm not in love with you anymore." Everything inside me seemed to still. The words were so simple, yet so profound. And in that moment, something clicked in my mind. I had spent so much time thinking I was the only one holding this love, this truth inside me, but now I understood. It wasn't just me. It was both of us, tangled together in this mess of desire, fear, and longing. And the moment we finally let go of the fear of losing each other, when we both finally admitted what we had known deep down, we could finally be free. It was terrifying, it was raw, but it was real. And that, I realized, was the most beautiful thing of all. As we stood there, two people who had circled around this love for far too long, I knew without a doubt that the moment I realized I was in love with him wasn't just the best day of my life. It was the beginning of something even more extraordinary. The start of a life where we were no longer afraid to be who we truly were together.